This step-by-step botanical watercolour tutorial will make this rose a pleasure to paint using just 5 colours and lots of colour glazing to level up your watercolour painting game. I begin by tracing down my line drawing, and this is how I do it. There is a free traceable line drawing and reference photograph in the Facebook group, details of which I will tell you about a little later on in this video. Once you have traced down your drawing, make sure that it has no sketchy edges and it's a clean outline. We are using a limited palette of just 5 colours today, and I will put all the equipment that I use in this tutorial in the description box underneath this video, but make sure that you use whatever colours you have, and I'll explain why a little later on. I've mixed a small puddle of cadmium yellow on my palette, and you'll need to add a lot of water to this mix to make it as weak as you can. This will form the base colour of the rose, and to begin with I'm working wet in wet, which means that I'm applying the water to the pencil line. We will drop the paint in a little bit later on, so make sure that you apply the water just where you want the paint to go. Watercolour is all about glazing in various layers, so you want your first wash to be really weak, just to form the base colour on which you will build later. You can see on my palette that I have a separate puddle of water, and in case you're wondering why I'm using it from the palette and not the jar, it just gives me a little bit more control over the water that I apply onto the paper. You may find it helpful to do this as well. I'm using for this initial wash is a number 3 size spotter. I find it helps control the application, but just use the brushes that you feel comfortable with. I continue this process over the rose, and I will let this dry before applying other colours. The paint set that I'm using are from Schmink, but use your favourite brand. I'm taking the yellow tone over the stem as well, just to give it a base tone. You don't have to do this. Now that the paint has completely dried, I'm adding some ultramarine to the cadmium yellow to form a green tone, and I'm also going to add a tiny bit of olive. Olive within the kit that I'm using, I would say, is more of a kind of hooker's green colour, but just mix the colour similar to the tone that I have on the palette. Again, I'm working wet in wet for the sepals of the rose, leaving the centre free so that you can have the lighter area down the middle. And you can see how I'm dipping in and out of the 2 green tones on my palette, just to make sure that the colours applied aren't flat and have a real organic feel to them. It's all about watercolour glazing and applying the colours on top of each other to form the depth that we need, which we will do later on in this tutorial. I'm using a number 2 size spotter to wiggle the brush into the smaller areas. The darker green that I'm using on the palette is French ultramarine with a tiny bit of cadmium yellow. And applying the same to the stalk. So now that the paint has dried, again I've cleaned down my palette and I'm going to add some more pigment to this, and I'm using the number 3 size spotter, I think it was, and again mixing some cadmium yellow, this time with a bit of cadmium red. For the schmink set, I would say cadmium red is quite sort of cadmium scarlet, but we want it to be a sort of muted yellow tone, similar to maybe Indian yellow. So I'm applying this wet on dry using the tip of my spotter brush, and I apply it right up to the pencil line. Once the colour is in place, I then clean my brush and pat it on the kitchen towel like this and just blend it into the paper. I use this blending method throughout the tutorial, so I won't keep saying it, but this is what I do. I apply the paint like this, clean the brush, pat it on the kitchen towel, and then blend it gently using the damp brush into the existing wash that is now dry. This gives a really natural soft blur. And once you get the hang of it, I promise you it's really, really easy and you will love how it makes your paintings look. I recommend you watch this video all the way through so that you can watch me push past the awkward stage and watch the painting come to life. Now that we have the base colour in place, we can think about our reds, and I'm mixing Carmine on its own, Carmine with a tiny bit of Cadmium Red, and I've watered it down, and the middle is a mixture of Carmine and Cadmium Red. And you can see me using a small brush to apply the colours as shown, paying careful attention to my reference photograph as I go along, working each petal in turn. Earlier on I mentioned we have a Facebook group where you can access the line drawing and reference photograph for free. I'll put the link in the description box below, so do consider joining us there, and you can post up your finished paintings and have some feedback. By the way, if you have any questions about your watercolour struggles, do drop them in the comments below and I will do my absolute best to help you out with them. And if you are enjoying this video, do give it a like. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you enjoy my content and I can continue to bring you these free tutorials. So I'm mixing between the colours on my palette, just choosing the colour that I feel is necessary to apply where it is needed. You'll see from the photograph that they kind of switch really gently between the warmer and cooler tones of the red. If you'd like to know how I selected my colours, I will explain how a little later on. You can see me here working wet and wet again to give a blurred edge to the red colour. And once again blending it in the way I usually do. This is a number 2 size flat synthetic brush, and I'm using it damp just to blur the paint together like this. This brush is also really good for any mistakes that you go outside the pencil line and lifting them out. So now I'm focusing my attention on the smaller parts of the rose like this. To give the rose a sense of uniformity, I've done a really simple plain water glaze with my number 6 size brush like this, and I've let it dry completely before continuing with the next step. It just helps merge the colours together. So now I'm mixing some yellow puddles. Again, we're back to the cadmium yellow, and I'm adding French ultramarine to one, and some green and ultramarine to the others, and you can see the darkness of the green here. And I also decide to add a tiny bit of one of the red colours to it just to make it really dark. Earlier on I spoke about matching colours, and here is how I do this. I've made a colour chart like this, and it's the only colour chart I ever use to match my colours, and if you'd like to know how I made it, I will put it on the top of the screen right now in an information card for you. So now I've switched down to my number 0 size brush, and because we have our template wash in place, we can now go over the areas we've already painted in with a darker tone. This will form the mid-tone and start to create some form within the rose. Botanical art is such a pleasure to paint. I really hope that you enjoy painting these tutorials as much as I enjoy showing them to you. You can see me here adding the darker tone of the green by using a kind of patting motion, and this will form the sort of natural fuzziness that we have within this particular sepal. I'm leaving a tiny gap between the outside of the sepal and the adjoining sepal, which gives it a sense of realism. And just jiggling my brush like this, wiggling my brush like this to form a little bit of texture within the sepals. I'm alternating between the greens on my palette, and don't worry if you don't have that exact colour, you just want the colours to look slightly different. And you saw me there adding a tiny bit of cadmium red just to give it a little bit of a browny tone. And I will add this to the outside of the stalk in a moment. Once again, now that everything is dry, I'm using a small brush to enhance the little spiky bits on the sepals. The paint does have to be dry when you apply smaller washes, but just make sure that you use a small brush to get into the corners. And you can see me now beginning to form some shape within the sepals like this by wiggling the brush once more to create that texture. Everything is now dry, so I've cleaned down my palette and I have 3 petals. The first one being Cadmium Red with Carmine, and the other one we have the 2 with the French ultramarine. So one is a sort of orangey tone, one is a red tone, and one is a kind of burgundy tone. I hope that made sense. So I'll go through that again for you. We have Cadmium Yellow with Cadmium Red at the top. We have Cadmium Red on its own in the middle and Cadmium Red with French ultramarine on the bottom. And you can see I'm adding smaller petals with a little bit of water to just give that little bit more translucency there. And focusing on each petal in turn, looking at my reference photograph as I go through. You can see me working wet in wet again here. I've added some water to the paper and I'm dropping in some of the Cadmium Red and the burgundy tone on the outside. Once again, it just helps give it a little bit of a natural blur. This time I'm actually pulling some of the colour into the yellow tone that we've applied, just to give a little bit of veining and a little bit of detail. And I'm adding a little bit more cadmium yellow where I felt the yellow needed brightening. If you are enjoying painting botanical art and you'd like to take your painting to the next level, then we have a Patreon site, so I will put the details in the description box below, where you can really level up on your botanical painting. Using the number 2 synthetic brush here to gently lift out some of the colour on the top of that petal. I didn't want the colour to be solid, so that is why I do that. And it's a really good way of lifting out some of your colour. If you feel that maybe you've gone a little bit heavy-handed here and there, it's a really good way of removing some of the colour. I'm just enhancing the layers that I've put in place now by just dipping in and out of the colours that I have on my palette, using that burgundy tone to really sharpen up the colour that we've already applied. This gives it a really good sense of sharpness and it looks deliberate and beautiful. I've added a really weak mix of the burgundy colour to a tiny bit of yellow to add it into the areas underneath the petals where the petal overlaps on itself, so that we can create a tiny bit of a sort of shadow, so that you can see how it gives it another bit of dimension. So you just want to apply this in a really watery consistency, and I'm just enhancing some of the yellow tone there as well with a tiny bit of cadmium yellow. I've mixed the same green tones as I did earlier, and I'm letting them dry slightly on the palette so that I can use them in a kind of drier consistency to enhance the sepals like this, using a number 0 size brush. And I will just continue the entire process until the rose is complete, but we still have a little way to go. You can see how I'm really sharpening up those little spiky bits. Please tell me what they're called in the comments below if you know. As I apply the paint to this other sepal, you can see once again I'm enhancing the greens that I've applied earlier, making sure that I stay out of the middle bit where it's a lot lighter. Also sharpening up those edges that I applied earlier. You can see how this makes that little gap that we left really stand out. And I'm using a wiggling motion to once again enhance that white line, and a soft patting motion to create a little bit of texture. So it really is a case of just applying the detail where you feel it is needed, and maybe outlining some of the lighter colours that you applied earlier to add some tonal variation. And there we have our completed rose.